Hello, welcome to Ancient Text Podcast. We're on Book 8 of Historia Regum Brittaniae by Geoffrey of Monmouth. After Merlin had delivered his prophecies, everyone was pretty impressed. Vortigern was especially impressed. Merlin was a one-in-a-million speaker. Vortigern, seeing he apparently had a clairvoyant standing before him, asked how he would die. Merlin answered, "Fly by the fire of the sons of Constantine, if you are able to. Already they are preparing their ships. Already they are leaving the shores of Armorica. Already they are spreading their sails to the wind. They will steer towards Britain. They will invade the Saxon nations. They will subdue that wicked people, but first they will burn you while you're shut up in a tower. To your own ruin did you prove a traitor to their father, and invited the Saxons into the island. You invited them for your safety, but they came as a punishment to you. 2 deaths instantly threaten you. Nor is it to determine which you could more easily avoid, for on the one hand, the Saxons will destroy your country and endeavor to control you. On the other, there shall arrive the 2 brothers, Aurelius Ambrosius and Uther Pendragon, whose business will be to revenge their father's murder upon you. Seek out some refuge if you can. Tomorrow they will be on the shores of Totnes. The faces of the Saxons will look red with blood, Hengist will be killed, and Aurelius Ambrosius shall be crowned. He will bring peace to the nations. He shall restore the churches, and then die of poison. His brother Uther Pendragon shall then succeed him, whose days will also be cut short by poison. There shall be present at the commission of this treason your own issue, whom the boar of Cornwall shall devour." End quote. And as predicted by Merlin, early the next day, Aurelius Ambrosius and Uther Pendragon landed in Britain with 10,000 men. As soon as the news of Aurelius' coming was spread, the Britons met together from all over the war-torn country, and getting a new wind of strength from coming together with their countrymen, they displayed unusual vigor. The clergy assembled and appointed Aurelius Ambrosius as king, and paid him the customary homage. The people were desperate to get to war with the Saxons. He dissuaded them from acting so quick because he had a score to settle with good old Vortigern. So he marched into Cambria to the town where Vortigern had taken a refuge called Gonerau, in the country of Hergen on the river Gania in the Clarius Mountains. Upon arriving, Ambrosius, with the whole murder of his father thing on his mind, he said the following to Eldal, Duke of Gloucester, quote, "See, noble Duke, whether the walls of the city are able to protect Vortigern against my sheathing this sword in his bowels. He deserves to die, and you cannot, I suppose, be ignorant of his treachery. The most villainous of men, whose crimes deserve inexpressible tortures. First he betrayed my father Constantine, who had delivered him and his country from invasions from the Picts. Afterwards, my brother Constance he betrayed, who, he made him king just to use him as a puppet, and then he killed him. Then he crowned himself and brought pagans into our society in order to suppress those who stood loyal to me. But now, by the good providence of God, he unwarily fell into his snare, which he had laid for my faithful subjects. For the Saxons, when they found out how wicked he is, drove him out from the kingdom. Not that we should care. This, I think, is a matter of grief that this odious people, who that detestable traitor invited over, has kicked out of the nobility, laid waste to a fruitful country, destroyed the holy churches, and almost extinguished Christianity over the whole kingdom. Now, therefore, my countrymen, show yourselves as men. First revenge yourselves upon the traitor who caused all these disasters. Then let us turn our arms against our enemies and free our country from their brutish tyranny." End quote. Immediately, they set their siege engines to work and labored to beat down the walls. They failed to do so, so they set fire to fuel and burned out the tower with Vortigern in it. Hengist was terrified at this news, as he feared the valor of Aurelius. Aurelius Ambrosius was seen as a badass that nobody on the continent could mess with. Whenever he fought, he'd either successfully dismount his enemy or break their spear. He was generous, religious, temperate, and honest, could fight on his feet, on his horse, and run an army like nothing. He's a doctor, and a lawyer, and a good kisser. Word of his feats had traveled to the Saxons from Armorica, so the Saxons, fearing him, fled beyond the river Humber, and in those parts fortified the cities and towns. As this place was their refuge, Scotland, according to Geoffrey, was wholly uninhabited. so it made for a safe retreat for strangers. The Saxons fled here so that they could fall back in case of, a military emergency. This was taken as great news by Aurelius, and it made him more confident in his chance of victory. So, assembling his people, he increased the number of his army and made a fast march to the north. In his passage through the country, he saw how it had been laid to waste, especially agreed at the churches that had been leveled. He promised to rebuild them if he was victorious. Hengist, preparing his defense, took the bravest of his men and exhorted them to fight gallantly. He tried convincing them that Aurelius had brought only a few Armoricans with him to Britain, numbering about 10,000. And the rest of their opposition were the same Britons they've beat hundreds of times anyways, so it should be easy, right? Hengist promised his men they would win, especially taking into consideration the greater number of soldiers he had, numbering 200,000. After this pep talk, he led his men towards Aurelius in a field called Masaebai, through which he suspected that Aurelius would pass. Hengist was trying to pull off an ambush. Aurelius caught wind of this plan and he didn't slow down. In fact, he hurried up to the field. Once he caught sight of Hengist's forces, he organized his men into ranks. He commanded 3,000 of his Armorican men to take to the saddle and fight as cavalry. The rest of the Armoricans were joined with the islanders to form a line of battle. The Domitians he placed in the hills, and the Nedocians in the nearby woods. His reason for this was that if the Saxons started to flee in these directions, they would be utterly destroyed because they're already fleeing. Oh, more soldiers, you're dead. While all this was happening, Eldol spoke to the king. Quote, "This one day shall suffice for all the days of my life, if by good luck I get to do combat with Hengist, for one of us would die before we split. I still retain deeply fixed in my memory the day we were supposed to have negotiations, and him villainously making use of the occasion to assassinate every one of us who came. Only I escaped, making my defense with a stake of wood, which I had found accidentally, until I could flee. The day was very fatal. 460 barons and nobles were killed, all unarmed. From that conspiracy, God was pleased to deliver me by throwing a stake at my feet, which allowed me to defend myself and escape." Unquote. This contains new information. Book 6 tells this story, but doesn't mention that Eldol was the only survivor. Anyways, after Eldol had spoken, Aurelius told his companions to place all their hope in Christ and to make a brave assault of one mind on the enemy in defense of their country. Hengist was just as busy, walking up and down his ranks, pumping up their spirits. At last, both armies, being drawn out in battle formation, began the attack. Both sides maintaining their bravery and losing lots of blood. Aurelius animated the Christians, and Hengist animated the pagans. The whole time during the battle, Eldol was fixed on fighting Hengist, but had yet to have the opportunity. Eventually, Hengist found that his men had been routed and the Christians had won, perhaps even because they were Christian. Hengist fled to the town called Caerconin, which is now called Coningsborough. Aurelius followed and killed or enslaved all Saxons he found on the way. When Hengist saw he was being followed, he stopped outside the town and ordered his troops for another engagement. He knew he wouldn't last in a siege of this town and that he had to stand and fight now. His security now lied in his sword. Aurelius attacked furiously. Here, the Saxons steadily maintained the ground, regardless of the numbers fallen. On both sides, there was lots of slaughter, the groans of the dying causing greater rage in those that survived. The Saxons almost won, and then the Armorican cavalry attacked the Saxons by surprise. The Saxons lost ground, and once they were spread too thinly, they were not able to rally again. The Britons saw they could win, so they exerted themselves to fight, and fought with all their strength to distress the enemy. Aurelius was in the front lines with his men, encouraging them and leading by example, for he killed all that stood in his way. Eldol was also being a badass, running up and down the line of battle to assault his enemies, but still, he was looking for his opportunity to encounter Hengist personally. There were several movements made by the armies on each side. An opportunity occurred for Eldol and Hengist to do battle, and they did. In this encounter of the two greatest champions of the field, fire sparked at the clashing of their weapons, and every stroke seemed to produce both thunder and lightning. The duel between them was suspenseful, as it would decide the tide of battle. During this, Gorla, Duke of Cornwall, came with his troops and did damage to the enemy. Eldol saw this, and he became assured that they had been won. So he struck Hengist on the helmet, and by brute force grabbed Hengist and dragged him out among the Britons, In joy he cried out, God has fulfilled my desire, my brave soldiers. Down, down with your enemies, the Ambrones, which this is, I think this just uses a generic name for like Germanic invaders here. The victory is now in your hands. Hengist is defeated, and the day is your own. End quote. The Britons fought valiantly still against the pagans. While they sometimes gave ground, their courage did not fail them in making a good defense. They gave their enemy no rest until they had been vanquished. The Saxons fled to wherever they could think of. Some to cities, some to the woods, some to the hills, others to their ships. But Octa, the son of Hengist, made his retreat with a great number of men to York, and Eosa, his kinsman, went to the city of Valclud, where he had a very large army. Aurelius, after his victory, took Caerconin and stayed there for 3 days. While there, he issued orders for the dead to be buried and the wounded to be healed, and to tell the army to relax since they were probably fatigued from all the fighting. Aurelius then called together his top military commanders for a meeting, where they would decide what to do with Hengist. Present at the meeting was Eldad, Bishop of Gloucester, not to be confused with his brother Eldal. Eldad was a priest of great wisdom and piety. As soon as Eldad saw Hengist standing before the king, he demanded silence and said, "Morally, we might think to set him free, but I would cut him into pieces." The prophet Samuel warns this, who, when he had Agag, king of Amalek, in his custody, cut him into pieces, saying, "As thy sword hath made women childless, so shall thy mother be childless among women." Therefore, the same should be done to Hengist. Accordingly, Eldal took his sword, led Hengist out of the city, and cut off his head. Aurelius, who was a pretty moderate guy, commanded Hengist should be buried, and then a mound of dirt he piled upon his grave, as was customary of the pagans, which that's a real thing. Called what? They're called like burial mounds. Aurelius then brought his army to work to besiege Octa, Hengist's son. Once besieged, Octa was unsure as to whether he should put up a fight with such a triumphant army. After thinking about it, he went out with all the nobles he had present. He was carrying a chain in his hand, and he had sand on his head. He presented himself to Aurelius and said, "My gods are vanquished, and I doubt not that the sovereign power is in your God, who has compelled so many noble people to come before you and surrender. So please accept of us and of this chain. If you do not think we are fit objects of your clemency, here we present ourselves, ready to be fettered and undergo any punishment you decide." This guy's just a glutton for punishment. Jeez. Aurelius was taken aback and felt pity. So he asked his council what he should do. Once again, Eldad chimes in and says, another biblical quote, "The Gibeonites voluntarily came to the children of Israel to desire mercy, and they attained it. Should we as Christians be worse than the Jews in refusing them mercy? It is mercy which they beg. Let them have it. The island of Britain is large and has uninhabited places. Let us make a covenant with them and let them live in some desert place where they will live as our vassals." End quote. The king took Eldad's advice and granted Octa clemency. After this, Eosa and the rest of the Saxons who had fled, hearing that Octa got clemency, came to surrender also and were admitted the same favor. The king therefore granted them the country bordering upon Scotland, quote unquote. I don't really know exactly what that means. This could be referring to like the islands west or north of Scotland, or just like such a far point north of Scotland. Geoffrey wouldn't even call it Scotland. I don't know. The enemies now being entirely reduced, the king summoned the councils and princes of his kingdom together at York, where he gave orders for restoring churches which the Saxons had destroyed. He himself undertook the rebuilding of the church of that city and other cathedrals in that province. After 15 days, after he had found workers for all the construction to be done, he went to London, which had not escaped the wrath of the Saxons. He was sad when he saw the destruction made to it. He called in citizens from all over the island and began the restoration of the city. Here he settled the affairs of the whole kingdom, revived the laws, restored the right heirs to the possessions of their ancestors, and to those properties which had lost all heirs due to various calamities and wars, he distributed to his soldiers. His time was totally sapped up by all the stuff to do, reestablishing his nation and the peace and the law. He then went to Winchester to repair the ruins of that, as he did other cities. And when the work was finished, he went, as Bishop Eldad insisted, to the monastery near Caradoc, now Salisbury, where the consuls of princes that Hengist had murdered were buried. At this place, there was a convent with 300 monks living there, situated on the mountain of Ambrius, who was also credited with founding the convent. The sight of the place where the dead lay made the king, who was a compassionate guy, cry and think of what type of monument to erect here. He thought something ought to be done to pay a memorial at this piece of ground, which contained the bodies of many noble patriots who died for their country. For this purpose, he summoned together carpenters and masons and commanded them to employ their art well as possible in contriving some new structure for a lasting monument to those men. They weren't so confident they could build something so grand, so they refused. Treminus, the bishop of the city of Legions, went to the king and said, "You should get Merlin in here. You know, that guy, he advised Vortigern. He's like the smartest person in the land. He's a clairvoyant. He's an architect. He's a doctor. He's a lawyer. He's a good kisser." I'm sorry, those last two things were jokes. Sorry. Anyways, Aurelius asked many questions about Merlin and eventually resolved to send out for him. Aurelius's men found him in the country of Gewis in modern Wales. The king's men took Merlin to Aurelius, who received him joyfully and commanded him to use his famous gift of prophecy. Merlin, in response, said, "Mysteries of this kind are not to be revealed unless it's totally necessary. If I pretend to utter prophecies for ostentation or diversion, the spirit that instructs me would become silent, and it would leave me when I needed it the most." Merlin made the same refusal to everyone present. Everyone was just bugging him to do prophecies. And eventually the king stopped bugging him about prophecy and asked about his plans for a monument. Merlin said, "If you are desirous to honor the resting place of these men with a permanent monument, send for a structure called the Giant's Dance, which is in Mount Clarius." This is thought to refer to the hill of Usnick in Westmeath, Ireland. "For there is a structure of stones which no one of today's age could raise without profound knowledge of the mechanical arts. They are stones of vast magnitude and wonderful quality. And if they could be placed here, as they are there, around this spot of ground, they will stand forever." End quote. If you haven't figured it out, Merlin was referring to Stonehenge. After Merlin had spoke, Aurelius laughed at him and said, "Why would we bring stones from a different island? As if there wasn't stones in Britain." Merlin replied, "Spare me the vain laughter, for I'm without vanity. They are mystical stones of a medicinal value. The giants of old brought them from the farthest coasts of Africa and placed them in Ireland while they lived there. Their design in this was to make baths with them. When they got sick, they would wash the stones and bathe in the runoff water, which always worked in curing them. They could also use this method to heal wounds, which in addition would only require some herbs." End quote. When the Britons heard this, they were resolute to go get these mystical stones and to fight the Irish if they had to, if they tried stopping them. Uther Pendragon was put in charge of this expedition. They were to also bring Merlin, who had helped direct it. With 15,000 men, they got together a fleet, set sail, and a fair wind brought them to Ireland. At this time, Gillemanius, a young man of valor, was king in Ireland, and he, upon hearing the arrivals of the Briton in his kingdom, raised a vast army and marched to meet the Britons. When Gillemanius heard what they were there for, he smirked and said to the men around him, "No wonder a cowardly people," I think he's referring to the Saxons, "were able to almost destroy the island of Britain. The Britons are brutes and fools. Have you even heard of such a joke? Why do they want stones from Ireland, let alone enough to come for them in an act of warfare? To arms, soldiers, defend your country. While I have life, they shall not take from us the least stone of the Giant's Dance." End quote. Uther, seeing them prepared for battle, attacked them. The Britons quickly gained the advantage, spreading out and killing the Irish, and forcing King Gillemanius to flee. After the victory, they went straight to Mount Clarius and found the structure of stones. While they're all just standing around, Merlin was like, "All right, guys, let's move the stones. Have at it." The men tried moving moving the stones with cables, ropes, levers, at which Merlin laughed, and then he began his own plans. The book doesn't quite describe how Merlin managed to move the stones, except that he used machines to knock them over and gave the men directions to carry the stones to the ships. After this was done, they gleefully set sail and returned to Britain and went to the burying place with these stones. Once Aurelius noticed this, he called for clergy and common folk alike to come to Mount Ambrius to celebrate with joy and honor the erection of the monument. So came the bishops, abbots, and people of all other orders. And on the day and place the meeting was held, Aurelius placed the crown upon his head, and with royal pomp celebrated the feast of the Pentecost. The solemn festival he continued for 3 days. During this time, he appointed vacant landholdings upon his companions as reward for their service. At that time, the 2 metropolitan dioceses of York and Legions were vacant, and with the consent of his people, who he wanted to please in this choice, he granted York to Saxo, a man of great quality and celebrated for his piety, and the city of Legions he gave to Dubricius, who Providence, I guess that means God Providence, I don't know, had pointed out as the useful pastor. After settling these and other affairs of the kingdom, Aurelius ordered Merlin to set up the stones brought from Ireland, which he did, and placed them in the same order as they had been in the mountain Kilaris, thereby giving manifest proof of the prevalence of art above strength. Yep, sounds like something a writer would say. At this time, Pasentius, the son of Vortigern, who had fled into Germany, was levying the forces of that kingdom in order to go fight King Aurelius. He wanted revenge for his father's death, and promised his army tons of gold and silver if they could help him to succeed in conquering Britain. When he had last fooled the youth of that country with his grandiose promises, he assembled a vast fleet and arrived in northern parts of Britain, wreaking havoc. Aurelius, hearing of this, got his army together and set out against them to challenge them in battle. The challenge was accepted, and by divine will, the Saxons were defeated and made to flee. After Pasentius was defeated, he didn't return to Germany, but instead went over to Ireland to talk with Gillemanius, who received his company well. After sharing sob stories about how they both got their asses handed to them by the Britons, they resolved to enter a confederacy together and mount a war against the Britons. They got a fleet together, and they embarked, arriving in Britain in the city of Menevia, which is at the center south shore of Wales. Uther Pendragon took up command of the army and headed to meet the enemy, as his brother, the King Aurelius, was laid up sick at Winchester. When Pasentius, Gillemanius, and the Saxons heard this, they rejoiced, thinking the king being sick was their key to victory. Among the subsequent conversations, one of the Saxons named Eopa came to Pasentius and said, "What reward would you issue to the man that could kill Aurelius Ambrosius?" Pasentius replied, "If I could find a man of such great resolution, I would give him 1,000 pounds of silver and my friendship for life, and if by good fortune I could gain the crown of Britain, I would make him a centurion." Eopa replied, "I have learned the British language and know the mannerisms of their people, and I have a skill in medical treatment. If you fulfill this promise, I will pretend to be a Christian and a Briton, and as a physician I will be admitted into the king's presence. I will feed him a poison which will kill him, and to make sure this will work, I will don the clothes of a monk." Pasentius agreed to this arrangement. So Eopa cut off all of his hair and his beard and posed as a monk, and was able to slip right into the king's court under the guise of being a physician. He said the king would heal if he were to drink his potions. The court urged him to feed the king a potion, so he did, and of course it was poison. He ordered the king to fall asleep so the potion would work faster, and Ambrosius died in his sleep, with Eopa nowhere to be found in the court as he had already escaped. During these events at Winchester, in the sky appeared a star of great size and brightness, projecting out a ray, at the end of which was a globe of fire in the form of a dragon, out of whose mouth projected 2 further rays, one of which seemed to stretch itself out over Gaul, and the other towards the Irish Sea, and it ended in 7 lesser rays. At the appearance of the star, people were afraid and amazed. Uther was not scared by it, but was very curious as to what it meant. Among others, he ordered Merlin to come to him. Merlin was already present, so he gave advice, military advice during this war. When Merlin was commanded to interpret what the star meant, he burst into tears and cried out, "An irreparable loss, O distressed people of Britain. The illustrious prince is departed, the renowned king Aurelius Ambrosius is dead, and his death will prove fatal to us all unless God helps us. Make haste, noble Uther, to engage the enemy in battle. The victory will be yours, and you will be king of Britain. For the star and the fiery dragon under it represents yourself, and the ray extending towards Gaul means you have a potent son to whose power Gaul will be subject to. But the other ray signifies a daughter whose sons and grandsons will successfully enjoy the kingdom of Britain to themselves." Uther doubted Merlin's words, but went forth to fight regardless. He was now within a half-day's march of Menevia. When Gilomanius, Pasentius, and the Saxons learned he was approaching, they went out to fight him. Forces on each side split into several divisions and advanced on each other. Many men were lost. Towards the end of the day, Uther won, with Gilomanius and Pasentius dying, allowing the Britons a complete victory. The barbarians fled to their ships, but were slain by their pursuers. Uther now learned that the king was dead, and that he had been buried within the giant's dance, Stonehenge, which there are lots of burials there, actually. All the clergy attended his funeral. In his lifetime, he had ordered that he be buried in a tomb carved out of rock there. And in the end, he indeed was buried and such. So he's buried in a rock at Stonehenge. I'm not sure if there's ever been an archaeological find there, but Uther, having then assembled the clergy, took the crown, and by the consent of all was advanced to king. Remembering the explanation Merlin had of the star that was previously mentioned, the king commanded 2 statues of dragons to be built of gold, in the likeness of the dragon he had seen emanating from the star. Once they were finished, he gifted one to the cathedral of Winchester, and kept the other for himself, to carry along with him in his military campaigns. From this time, he was called Uther Pendragon, which Geoffrey says in the British language means the dragon's head, named after Merlin's prediction where he saw the cosmic dragon and Uther would become king, etc. In the meantime, Octa, son of Hengist, and his kinsman Eosa, seeing they were no longer bound by the treaty they had signed with the former king, Aurelius Ambrosius, began to wage war. Allying with what leftover Saxons Pasentius had brought over, and calling in reinforcements from Germany, he arranged a vast army. He had conquered from Albania to the north all the way down to York. When they were besieging York, Uther Pendragon came upon him with his entire army. The Saxons fought very well, and eventually won, and forced the Britons to flee. The Saxons then pursued the Britons to the mountain Damon. I couldn't initially find anything. I try to relay most of these geographical sites they reference. I couldn't find anything initially on a mountain called Damon. I found some blog posts, Shadows in the Mist.blogspot, and they say there that what's his name? August Hunt says there that on the surface you may assume this means Wingate Hill because it's a very historically important hill that's close to where this was supposed to have happened. But August Hunt suspects it's actually referring to the nearby rock formation, the Hens, the Roaches, and the Ramshaw rocks, due to Geoffrey's description of the mountains being very rocky, while Wingate Hill is just kind of a hill. Anyways, Geoffrey says the mountains were high, rocky, and wooded, so a great place to hide. The Britons climbed the mountain and camped there all night. As it came closer to day, Uther commanded present consuls and princes to be called to a meeting, to ask if anyone had any ideas. Gorla, Duke of Cornwall, Port Gorla, was allowed to speak first due to him being respected military matters. He said more or less, "Hey guys, we're outnumbered. I don't think we'll win in a fight in the morning. So we should attack now, while it's still nighttime. So we have them by surprise." Everyone agreed to this plan. They got armed and formed up and snuck to their enemy camp. The enemy's watch spotted them and sounded trumpets to wake everyone up. The enemies all got confused. Half of them ran to the sea and ran around in fear and confusion. The Britons, knowing they were spotted, sped up their march, and in close ranks assaulted the camp after finding an entrance. They ran with swords to the enemy, who, caught even by this delayed surprise, couldn't put up a good defense. Riding this advantage, the Britons destroyed thousands of pagans, took Octa and Eosa as prisoners, and totally dispersed the Saxons for the millionth time. After this victory, Uther went to Alclud, where he settled local matters and restored peace. He also toured through Scotland with a fierce reign of quote unquote justice, thanks Joffrey, to reign in the rowdy locals. Criminals everywhere were terrified due to this, as Uther was not very nice to offenders. After he had settled affairs in the north, he went back to London and commanded that Octa and Eosa be kept in prison there. The following Easter, he called all nobles to London to hold a festival. Tons of people came, and the festival was grand yet solemn, and it was clear respect was happening between the king and his subjects. Present there was Gorla, Duke of Cornwall, and with him was his wife Igerna, who was exceedingly beautiful. The king noticed her and fell in love, and slowly started making the party about her. He had served her fresh dishes and gave her drinks and cups of gold, and the king, was making all the conversation towards her. Gorla noticed this and was pissed, and understandably left the court without taking the king's leave. Uther was pissed in return. Real mature, force this guy to watch you make him a cuckold. Real grown-up stuff, Uther. And commanded Gorla to return, or else he would make war upon Cornwall. And he did, setting fire to the cities of Cornwall, while Gorla avoided him, because of course Cornwall had an inferior army. Thinking he could eventually get reinforcements from Ireland, he was just drawing back, waiting for that to maybe happen. Gorla was more concerned about his wife than he was himself, so he put her in the town of Tintagel, which bordered the seashore. Gorla himself went to the castle of Dimiliac, which is thought to be, according to other sources other than Mear's book, which is thought to be on the hill where modern-day St. Denis is located, 20 miles inland from the shore of Tintagel. The king went to where Gorla was and besieged the town. After a week, Uther talked to one of his friends about his burning love, I wouldn't call it that, for Igerna. He said to his friend, Ulfin Ricardoc, quote, Ricardoc? Ulfin Ricardoc, let's go with that. Quote, well, not quote, I'm paraphrasing actually. He says, hey my guy, seriously, I like this chick so much that it might kill me. I desperately need your advice. Ulfin replied, who can assist us? I'm actually quoting here. Who can assist us in this matter when no force can infiltrate Titinkle? It is surrounded by sea, and the entrance to it is this natural rock, little canyon type thing. It's only 3 men wide, so that even just 3 men could defend against your entire army. I think your best bet is to ask Merlin. So the king called Merlin once again to the siege, and came Merlin. Merlin was briefed on the situation and saw that the king was extremely lovesick. Merlin said, quote, to accomplish your desire, you must make use of arts that have not been heard of in your time. I know how, by use of medicines, to give you the exact appearance of Gorla, so that you will seem exactly like him in all respects, if you obey my prescriptions. I will metamorphise you into Gorla, and Ulfin here is a Jordan of Tintagel, his familiar friend, and I myself will transform into a third shape and will make this adventure with you guys. In this disguise, we can safely go to where Igerna is and be admitted to her presence. End quote. The king complied, and indeed he was transformed into the likeness of Gorla. Ulfin to Jordan, and Merlin took the form of Brycel. Funny how they mentioned that Tintagel could only be defended by 3 men, and now it's being infiltrated by 3 men, eh? They arrived at twilight and were easily let in. It's the Duke of Cornwall and his friends, after all. Why wouldn't we let him in? Uther, in disguise, spent the night with Igerna, and had sex with her, still in disguise. This is kind of screwed up. Remember the end of Monty Python's Holy Grail, where the whole cast was arrested? I feel like that should probably happen right now. The king entertained her all night with amorous speech. He told her, in character as Gorla, he had left his former hiding place under siege so that he'd come and protect her personally. The lady, of course, swooned at all this and denied him nothing. This night, she conceived the famous King Arthur. In Uther's absence at Dimiliac, his maid made a foolish move and assaulted the walls. I guess that whole siege was still going on. This provoked the besieged Gorla to battle. Also acting foolishly is Uther's leaderless army took on a larger army than his own. Gorlaw was killed in the first brunt of the fight, and his men fled. The town was taken, and the king's army pillaged indiscriminately in the king's absence. After this, messengers came to Igerna with the news of, the real Gorlaw's death and the results of the siege. When these messengers saw, Uther, in disguise as Gorlaw, they were like, what? They thought they had let this guy left him for dead at the siege. The king laughed, embraced the countess, and said, "Your eyes may convince you that I am not dead, but alive. But regardless, the destruction of the town and slaughter of my men makes me sad, and I'm fearful of the king's arrival, so much that I will go out and meet with him, for fear of a worse disaster." Uther's really got a lot of nerve. Anyways, Uther left. He's left out the walls, went to his army, removed his disguise, and was briefed as to what happened at the siege. He wasn't particularly glad Gorlaw was dead, but he was glad that Igerna was now single. He then returned to Tintagel as Uther himself, took the town by force, and Igerna herself. Ooh. The two lived together with much affection, had a son and daughter, whose names were Arthur and Anne. Editor's note. I mean, I'm the only guy working on this thing, so I guess that technically makes me the editor, but the editor's note. Notice the narrator, also me, might use Albania and Scotland interchangeably. I have to point out I'm only doing that because so does the author, Geoffrey, or maybe it's the translator I'm going through, Aaron Thompson. So yeah, just pointing out not my design, it's just how the book is written. The words Albania and Scotland are used interchangeably. Also, if it wasn't obvious, Uther, Arthur, different names. We're now talking about Uther, the famous Arthur, comes in the next book. Back to the book. Over the course of time, the king was taken ill of a chronic disease. Meanwhile, the keepers of the prison in London where Octa and Eosa were held, their life wasn't very fun. So they let Octa and Eosa sweet-talk them into helping them flee into Germany. This worried people in Britain as there were reports of huge armies and fleets in Germany. The fear was justified. The Saxons indeed did return with a huge fleet and many men. They invaded Albania, burning and stabbing towns and people. In order to repulse the enemies, the command of the army in the king's absence was Sir Lot of County London. He was a consul, great knight, and experienced in years and wisdom and military. The king respected this man greatly and had given him his daughter Anne, and entrusted him with the rule of the kingdom while the king was out sick. Lot went to war with the invaders, and the war was a roller coaster. Huge wins, huge losses. Nobody knew what was going to happen. The biggest disadvantage to the Britons was their own pride, for they, out of disdain, disobeyed Lot's commands, which of course doesn't help any war effort when nobody's following what the general's saying. The island wasn't doing very well because of all of this. The king, hearing of this news, fell into a rage greater than his sickness. He commanded his nobility to come before him so he could reprimand them for their pride and cowardice. Uther knew this guy Lot was an ace, and that these pompous nobles were failing to follow his orders of his second in command. So he dressed down the nobles using harsh language, and he said he himself would have to lead them against the enemy. Of course, Uther was very sick, so the sick king ordered horses and a carriage to be made for him so he could attend the battle. He told the nobles they had to be ready to march against the army at the first opportunity. So, without delay, they set forth towards the enemy. The king and his army marched directly to Varalum, where the Saxons were being rapacious towards the people. When Octa and Eosa heard the king was coming and that he was being driven around, the guy was laying around in a carriage, they almost didn't want to fight him, saying it would be a shame for such brave men to fight one who was halfway dead. For this reason, Octa and Eosa drew all their forces into the city and, in contempt of any potential danger from their enemy, left their gates wide open. Uther isn't such a sucker for such psychological warfare, though. He commanded his men to besiege the city instantly and an assault on all walls of it. His orders strictly followed, The Britons were about to get over the walls and were about to begin a general assault when the Saxons, seeing they were actually in danger and that they had to give up their haughty pride, reduced their proud barbarian warrior selves to being in the stance of being in defense of a walled city. The Saxons mounted the walls and shot down showers of arrows and repulsed the Britons. The contest continued until nightfall brought an end to the fighting. The Saxons saw how their own pride had screwed them, and that the Britons seemed to have the advantage. The Saxons resolved to sally, or exit the city, at the break of day to do battle. These Saxons are ancient Germanic warriors, after all. They may have a better favor in the field, so why not? So accordingly, once daylight struck, they marched out in rank. The Britons, seeing them, divided themselves into several bodies and advanced towards them. They began the attack first, the Britons once again on assault, with Saxons on the defense. Much blood was shed, and the battle lasted all day, when at last both Octa and Eosa were killed, and the Saxons fled, leaving the Britons a total victory. I like how I have to paraphrase like half of this book, because anytime Geoffrey talks about politics, religion, it gets too poetic and wordy. These little battle parts I almost write down word for word because they're very concise. He describes battles very well. The king was in an ecstasy of joy over his victory. He couldn't even sit up by himself before this, but now he did. He said merrily, laughing, "These Saxons called me the half-dead king because I was so sick I had to lie in a wagon, and indeed I was. But victory to me, half-dead, is better to be safe and sound vanquished. To die with honor is preferable to living with disgrace." The Saxons, regardless of their defeat, were still up to no good. They went back up into Scotland and infested the people there. That's a nice way to put it, Geoffrey. Uther wanted to pursue them, but his nobles dissuaded him from it. He had only gotten more sick since his previous victory. This gave courage to the enemy, who would try anything to take this kingdom again. They, as bad guys in this book tend to do, resorted to spies and poison. They sent a spy to the king's court, where he learned that they were supplied by a nearby freshwater spring, which the king drank from, even in his very sick state where he couldn't stand to drink anything else. So the Saxons had the spring poisoned, which killed the king and 100 other people before the poisoning was discovered, after which a heap of earth was thrown over the well. Once the king's death was known, the bishops and the clergy of the kingdom assembled and carried his body to the convent of Ambrius, where they buried it with regal solemnity, close to the grave of Aurelius Ambrosius, inside of the Giant's Dance, also known as Stonehenge. Next time on Ancient Text Podcast, Arthur becomes king.